Hello everyone, I'm TrueCrimeCaitlyn and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you've joined me today for a little true crime chat. Today's case was one that was actually requested to me over on my TikTok account that I had never heard of, and when I researched it I couldn't believe what I was reading, and there were so many details, so I just knew I had to cover it on here. I'm going to tell you all as much as I can without the case, without going into massive detail, because this case is a lot. So today we're going to talk about one of the most sadistic cases that I think I have ever researched. This is the murder of 16-year-old Suzanne Jane Capper. Suzanne lived in Moston, Manchester with her mum Elizabeth, her stepdad John and her sister Michelle. Elizabeth and John would often clash. They had many arguments. This was a very tense and heated household. They did eventually divorce in 1990 and Elizabeth abandoned both of her girls. Suzanne would go on to be taken care of by the local authority, whereas Michelle kind of stayed with John and couch surfed and just really stayed wherever she could. Over her life, Suzanne felt no sense of belonging and she was deprived of the love that she so desperately wanted. Her biological dad was never in the picture, and now her mum has just abandoned and walked out on her. You can imagine that all of those feelings that Suzanne had were just heightened. A very vulnerable Suzanne began to Skype off of school and hang around with 26-year-old Jane Powell. Jane Powell was a single mother of 3 and she would often use Suzanne to babysit her kids. Suzanne looked up to Jane as a mother figure. She really loved, admired and respected Jane. Suzanne thought that through Jane and through her kids she had made her own family and she would do anything for them. But Jane didn't see Suzanne as family and she felt no love towards her at all. Jane's house was a local hotspot for parties, sex and drugs. Her house was pretty much always busy. She was a relatively big drug dealer and would employ teenage boys to distribute the drugs for her, and she had sexual relationships with most of these boys as well. Alongside drug dealing, Jane also orchestrated a lot of car theft. Sometime around August 1992, a woman named Bernadette McNeely moved into Jane's house with her 3 kids. Bernadette had a very fiery temper, which Suzanne would often be the subject to, and she would make very serious threats to people that she argued with. One instance of this is when she was arguing with one of our old neighbours. She threatened to burn their house down. Shortly after Bernadette's move, Suzanne showed up to her mum's new house after she had suffered a beating. Suzanne became the scapegoat in that house and she was often bullied and beaten relentlessly. Jane would accuse her of not looking after her kids properly. Bernadette accused Suzanne of stealing a pink puffer jacket from her, and she was unfortunately the victim of many assaults. Jane and Bernadette would often shout, scream, argue with Suzanne, and Suzanne never stuck up for herself. She believed that it was her fault that these monsters acted and behaved the way that they did, and that it was her job to make them love her, when in reality Jane and Bernadette were just cowards who bullied on someone they knew wouldn't fight back. When Suzanne left and went to her mother for help, instead of taking her daughter in and protecting her, her mother sent her away because her new boyfriend didn't want Suzanne living there. Feeling hopeless, rejected and having nowhere else to go, Suzanne made her way back to Jane's house. Jane and Bernadette would share sexual partners as well as sell drugs together. Together, these 2 women were very controlling, dominant and very manipulative. The teenagers that worked for these 2 women were idolised by them and they would do anything that Jane and Bernadette said at the drop of a hat. And they thrived off having this sense of control. One of the teenagers that they employed who has quite a big role in today's case was 16-year-old Anthony Hudson. Jane and Bernadette took a specific liking to Anthony. They would both have a sexual relationship with him and they would sometimes bicker over who owned Anthony. In November 1992, Jane, Bernadette and Anthony all contracted pubic lice and an STD. The women visited a doctor and were advised to shave off their pubic hair. For some reason, this really humiliated the women and they needed someone to blame. But instead of blaming Anthony or one of their many lovers or even each other, they decided to blame Suzanne. Their reasoning behind blaming Suzanne was that on occasion they would sometimes share a bed, and they believed that that's how they contracted the pubic lice and the STD. There was no evidence that Suzanne had either of these to pass on. Anthony was quite open in stating that he believed that he caught them off of Bernadette, but the women had made up their mind. They truly believed that they contracted these off of Suzanne and they wanted revenge. After being subject to more verbal and physical abuse, Suzanne once again left the house, this time going to her stepdad's. Despite Suzanne leaving and removing herself away from them, Jean and Bernadette could not let their fixation with her go. Even after she left, any problems that the women had, they would always somehow manage to blame Suzanne. While high on drugs, they would plot how they wanted to kidnap, torture, and eventually murder Suzanne. They really wanted to punish her for this whole pubic lice STD blame. They knew that in order to do what they wanted, they needed help. So who better to go to than these young teenage boys who they had complete control over? The first two people that were in on the plan was none other than Anthony and also Glyn Powell, who was Jean's ex-husband. On the 7th of December 1992, Jean and Bernadette made their way over to Suzanne's stepdad's house. Suzanne was really shocked to see these two on her doorstep and seemingly grovelling to her. They told her that they missed her, that the house wasn't the same without her, that they wanted her to come back and that they were sorry. Apologising was something that they never done. So apologising now wasn't because they were sorry, it was to perfectly manipulate Suzanne. Unfortunately, Suzanne believed what they were saying and left with them. As Suzanne walked into 97 Langworthy Road, she was immediately pounced on by Anthony and Glyn, who were waiting for her arrival. She was held down and restrained while Glyn shaved off all of her hair and her eyebrows. This was a sick act to humiliate her, to mirror the humiliation that Jean and Bernadette felt when they were told by a doctor to shave their pubic hair. Suzanne was forced to clean all of the hair up and put it into a bin before having her own pubic hair shaven. After this, she was subject to a horrifying, brutal beating. A plastic bag was placed over her head and the group took turns whacking Suzanne with these 3-foot wooden spoon and forks which were used for decoration. She was kicked, stamped on, hit, punched, beaten for hours on end. Once the group had had enough for that night, Anthony and Glyn dragged Suzanne up some stairs and put her in a dark cupboard where they left her overnight. Defenseless and scared, Suzanne would spend most of this night crying out in fear and pain. The children that were in the house could hear Suzanne's cries, and I can't imagine how it would feel to hear that, or to even be in that situation, full stop. Because the children were getting upset, again, Jean and Bernadette were getting angry with Suzanne without acknowledging that the reason Suzanne was crying was because of something they had done. They'd done everything just to spin all the blame onto Suzanne. So the next day, under Jean and Bernadette's order, Anthony and Glyn smuggled Suzanne into Bernadette's old house, which was just a few doors down. After being moved to Bernadette's old house, Anthony and Glyn tied Suzanne down, spread eagle, to an overturned bed and placed a gag in her mouth. The next few days, poor Suzanne was brutally tortured. To keep her awake through all of this, they would drug Suzanne by injecting her with amphetamines. Her kidnappers would taunt her before doing these disgusting, vicious acts by placing headphones on her. They would play a rave song full blast in Suzanne's ears that said the lines, "Hi, I'm Chucky, wanna play," from the Chucky films. 2 other men had now joined Jean, Bernadette, Anthony and Glyn in these torturous acts. They were named Clifford and Jeffrey. Later in an interview, Anthony had spoke about an incident where Clifford had pulled out 2 of Suzanne's teeth using pliers. He said, quote, "I was stood at the doorway with Jeannie and Bernie. Cliff took off her gag. He told her to open her mouth. He said, 'Right, I'm going to rip your teeth out.' He started hitting her teeth with the pliers. He got the pliers on and started pulling it out, but it just snapped and chipped. Then he hit them a few more times. He put the pliers on again and really pulled. He pulled Suzanne's head forward until there was a snap and he had the tooth in the pliers. He did the same again and he was laughing. One day, Suzanne had the smallest glimmer of hope when David Hill found her in Bernadette's house. He was an unfamiliar face and she was desperate for help, but unfortunately David wasn't her saviour. Although he didn't take part in any of the torture, he still massively let her down. When David found her, she was very obviously in pain, tortured, starved. She was lying in her own urine and feces. But David didn't help. Why? Because he was scared that Jane and Bernadette wouldn't sell drugs to him anymore. He put his own drug habit before another human being's life. Around the 13th of December, Suzanne's family began to grow very concerned when they hadn't seen Suzanne in a few days and they couldn't find or reach her. Michelle, Suzanne's sister, knowing that she spent a lot of time with Jane, went over to Jane's house to try and see if maybe she knew where Suzanne was. When both Jane and Bernadette told Michelle that they didn't know where Suzanne was, Michelle expressed to them how the family was worried sick and that they were going to contact the police. Knowing this really spooked Jane and Bernadette, and this is when they knew they had to get rid of Suzanne. Early hours on the 14th of December, 1 week after her kidnap, Anthony and Glyn forced Suzanne into the back of a stolen car and drove 15 miles to Werneth Law, which is a secluded kind of foresty area. They decided to kill Suzanne in the most brutal, inhumane way. Poor Suzanne herself, she was already so close to death. She was disoriented, she was starved, she was scared, she was just so confused at everything that was happening to her. It was Bernadette who doused 16-year-old Suzanne in petrol, then set her on fire. Jane, Bernadette, Anthony and Glyn seemed to get high off not just the drugs but for the adrenaline of what they had just done. As Suzanne was screaming in pain, she was literally on fire, this wicked group sang "Burn Baby Burn" to her. Confident that Suzanne was going to die where they stood, the group abandoned her and left her to die alone. Miraculously, somehow, after a full week of torture and being set on fire, Suzanne was still alive. She managed to put out the flames and crawl 400 yards to a nearby road, where she was found at around 6:10 a.m. by a man who was driving to work. When this man spotted Suzanne, he pulled over to help. He pulled her into his car and drove to the closest house to call an ambulance. Again, this is 1992, so mobile phones weren't really a thing then. While awaiting the ambulance, Suzanne drank 6 glasses of water. However, she couldn't hold the glass herself because of the amount of sheer pain that her hands were in. One of the homeowners later spoke about Suzanne and said, quote, "Both her hands appeared like ash. Her legs were just like raw meat and feet appeared to be badly charred. I was struck by how polite the victim was. She was constantly thanking my wife for assistance." Suzanne was rushed to Withington Hospital. When she arrived, her burns were so bad that her mum and stepdad couldn't visually identify her. The burns took up between 75 and 80% of her full body. Police spoke to Suzanne and she was able to tell them everything. The kidnapping, the drugging, the torture, the attempted murder, who done it and exactly where to find them. At 7:30 a.m, police arrived at Jane's house and found all the culprits exactly where Suzanne said they would be. They were all high on drugs and were still wearing the clothes that they wore when they set Suzanne on fire. While Jane and Bernadette were being arrested, they uncontrollably laughed and joked, but they had no idea that Suzanne was still alive. On the 18th of December, 4 days after her rescue, Suzanne slipped into a coma and sadly she never woke up. Her cause of death was organ failure due to the burns that she had sustained. The trial for Suzanne's kidnap and murder began on the 16th of November 1993 at Manchester Crown Court. During the trial, everyone turned on each other and tried to minimise their involvement. On the 17th of December, Jane, Bernadette and Glyn were all found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Anthony was also found guilty of murder and was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure for a minimum of 18 years. Jeffrey was sentenced to 12 years for false imprisonment. Clifford was sentenced to 15 years for false imprisonment and conspiracy to cause bodily harm. Now, you'll all be as shocked as I am to find that most of these monsters have been released from prison. Jeffrey was released in early 1998, only 6 years after Suzanne's death. Clifford was released in 2001. Anthony was released in 2013. And probably is one of the more shocking, one of the ringleaders for the whole entire thing, Bernadette, was released after serving only 25 years. She now lives under a new identity, but I did find a Facebook group which is all dedicated to Suzanne that people have managed to track her down. She now apparently lives in Reading and apparently works for Marks and Spencer's. And a detail that I just think is crazy is that she apparently lives in the same building as Karen Matthews. And that is today's case. Honestly, I have no words to describe how I feel speaking about this and thinking about what poor Suzanne had gone through. She was a beautiful girl who only wanted to be loved, and she was manipulated by these monsters. I hope that she is resting peacefully. She did not deserve any of this. And as for the 4 of them that's being released, that makes me physically sick. Like, I feel like justice hasn't been served for Suzanne now that they're out and about and just living life. Especially Bernadette, who was an eager participant of the torture and one of the ringleaders. Comment down below and let me know what you all think about these being released. Thank you to you all who have stuck around and listened with me all the way to the end of today's video. I just wanted to say a very quick thank you, as I have just hit over 500 subscribers and I couldn't be more grateful. Thank you all so much. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe as well, and I'll see you all on my next one.